Hi, my name is Sarah Gasda, and I am from NORCE, a Norwegian Research Institute in Bergen, Norway. And this is a recorded presentation of a lecture that I gave at the first underground hydrogen storage summer school that was hosted by TU Delft in July 2022. And I will be talking about how we transfer knowledge from CCS to underground hydrogen storage, and especially focus on the factors and criteria that are affecting large-scale deployment of this technology. So the outline of my talk will be first to go a little bit through large-scale CCS and what is happening today in terms of CO2 storage deployment, talk a little bit about some of the commercial scale issues that are common between CCS and hydrogen, and then talk a little bit more in detail about certain aspects that can be transferred between CCS to hydrogen. In this talk, I'll focus mainly on storage performance integrity and how the fluids are converted and immobilized in the subsurface and what that means from CO2 to hydrogen. But I will mention that monitoring and reporting, surface facilities and wells are also aspects that are important areas for hydrogen storage, but I won't be able to talk about them here. So this talk is really focused about applying CO2 knowledge in the hydrogen context, but we have to acknowledge the fact that underground energy storage has been underway for many decades in the form of natural gas, both in depleted oil and gas reservoirs, but also in salt caverns. There's certainly a lot to be transferred from energy storage from natural gas to hydrogen. And the question really is, what more can CO2 storage add to the existing knowledge base that we already gained from natural gas storage when it comes to cyclical behavior and storage of fluids? So it's a question that we'll look at is, what are the additional processes that are happening in the subsurface and additional risks that may be similar to something we've been looking at for CCS, but have not been really a topic for interest of natural gas storage. So very briefly about securing CO2 in nature and what that entails. First, it's about the capture facility itself, which I will not go further into, but that CO2 is captured from point source emitters or from direct air capture and can be transported long distances to the eventual storage site, which is kilometers deep underground. As with oil and gas and natural gas storage, we depend on the natural barriers that exist in the strata to secure that fluid that doesn't emerge back in the atmosphere. So for CO2, it's really about disposal. Calling it storage is in a way a bit of a misnomer. It's not the plan immediately to reclaim or recoup that CO2. But storage is a very widely used term here. So because disposal is really the main objective of CO2 storage, then it's really encouraged that CO2 naturally equilibrates with its surroundings, either by being trapped by capillary forces or dissolved or mineralized over time. So this is a figure from 2019 that shows the different types of CCS facilities that have either in operation or have been piloted and demonstrated at different facilities around the world. And the main thing to observe here is that deployment of CO2 storage and CCS in some form or another and at different scales is extremely widespread around the globe, which has a number of advantages. First, there's been testing of CO2 storage in a variety of settings, different types of sedimentary systems, onshore and offshore, and that has really built up a tremendous amount of experience in how CO2 storage works and what aspects are unique to each different kind of storage setting. So there have been, although the amount of CO2 in total tons is not enormous and certainly wouldn't be approaching anything we need yet for significant climate action, there have been many, many important learnings, and there's continual improvement from each and every site that is tested and taken either from pilot to demonstration or even industrial scale projects. So, for example, the Sleipner storage project offshore Norway has been in operation since 1996. So it really shows that there's been a good collaboration between research and industry over the past few decades, and that has been really crucial for solving some of the challenges and continually seeking new improvements. Another example of up-and-coming full-scale CCS projects is the Norway's Longship project, which will be for Norway the largest climate project ever, and it involves creating an onshore storage hub on the west coast of Norway, actually not very far from where I'm sitting here in Bergen, and CO2 will be shipped over relatively long distances. In the first phase will be shipping of CO2 from the Oslo region around the southern coast of Norway to eventually be deposited in an onshore terminal and then taken by pipeline out along the seafloor and injected into the storage complex. The plan for Northern Lights over time is to receive new shipments of CO2. In fact, there's a new contract that will, with a fertilizer plant in the Netherlands, that will send the CO2 northwards for eventual disposal. This is the Johansen formation. This is the target formation for CO2 to be stored. And this is a type of storage setting where the CO2 is injected and is slowly moving, migrating through this deep, several kilometers, 2 kilometers underground to be permanently secured. So CCS has really shown us that at the deployment scale, there are some common themes that I think will emerge between CCS and underground hydrogen storage. And the first is that the scale of CCS and the sheer magnitude of the fluids that need to be handled really require opening up new areas for underground storage beyond what we had available already from petroleum, say, for example, in depleted oil and gas reservoirs. The other aspect is about the understanding and tools that we have from petroleum really do lay a very good foundation for underground storage of other types of fluids. But that competence in and of itself is not sufficient for industrial scale CO2 storage, and probably the same will be the case for underground hydrogen storage. And that's because there are really some unique challenges that we've seen for CO2 that we're already learning about hydrogen, that reveal some gaps in the knowledge base that we inherited from oil and gas, and that's particularly with regard to fluid interactions, fluid rock interactions, or even fluid interactions with the microbial communities underground. For CO2 storage, there has been a clear need for additional storage resources well above and beyond what we have knowledge of from the oil and gas community. And so this spurred an enormous effort worldwide across all continents to understand and map the storage resources that are available for every major sedimentary basin. There is a little bit of a variety and diversity in how mature the understanding is, but you can see here in this map from the Global CCS Institute that there is no sedimentary basin nearly that hasn't been looked at in some form or another. And regional storage atlases exist, for example, from the Norwegian North Sea in the US, Australia, and China, of what type of resources are there. A lot of these atlases and understanding we get is from what we call high-level screening tools. For example, the CO2 screen tool from the National Energy Technology Laboratory in the US or from the Norwegian Petroleum Directorate. It has a process set up where you take the data that we have available and go through a type of evaluation process to understand what percentage of the sedimentary basin is suitable for CO2 storage. Different things play a role in this, in particular with respect to the injectivity and the seal integrity, which of course will be very similar for hydrogen as it is for CO2. But other aspects that will be different would be, for example, the depth of the resource and the appropriate depths for which you want to screen away. For example, CO2 storage resources that are have to be below 800 meters due to the dramatic change in density, and therefore you get a much higher storage efficiency with much greater depths. This is not a theme for hydrogen, and so that may be less of a restriction in screening of different storage resources. Another aspect that may be different is the proximity for CO2 storage, as I've shown with the Northern Lights project, that the ability to ship CO2 over long distances really opens up a wider areas. But for hydrogen, the thinking is that the proximity will play a greater role. It's not amenable for shipping to the extent that it's less compressible, and also the embrittlement factor also plays a role in how easily it is to transport via pipelines. So in the sense that the CO2 storage community has gone through already a quite large effort to map and screen resources, especially developing an understanding of how to come up with common specifications for what we mean by the maturity of a storage resource. All of these types of activities show that it is possible to implement such an effort, and that, of course, maybe some new assessment techniques will be developed for hydrogen, but that we have been there before. Let's talk a little bit about the storage settings comparison for CCS versus underground hydrogen storage. With CCS, there's essentially two main types of settings. One would be CO2 storage in a structural closure, where you're using the geology to hold the volume of gas in place for a desired time period, versus migration-assisted storage, where you use natural processes to transform and stabilize and immobilize the CO2 over time. Both of these are suitable for CO2 storage, and there are lots of examples of both types of storage settings. And of course, there's lots of analogs. For example, oil and gas always accumulates in some type of structural closure, whereas oil and gas, of course, has migrated through different updip and over long distances, sometimes being immobilized and sometimes ending up in a structural trap. So on the left, of course, is really the only type of option you would want for underground hydrogen storage, because it essentially is holding that volume until you want to take it back out again. For CO2, we don't need to take it back out, and as long as its seal integrity is very good, then that CO2 will, of course, stay there, as has oil and gas accumulated and been stored for hundreds of millions of years. On the right, of course, this is not a good option for underground hydrogen storage. It's only suitable for permanent disposal, because you are the objective is to immobilize the injected gas. So as I said, there are lots of examples of both. I'll show a couple for structural closures. There are 3 or 4 that I just plucked out of the knowledge base about what types of sites are up and coming that have been evaluated to great detail, particularly in Australia, in England, off the coast of Norway, and off the coast of the Netherlands. So these are relatively straightforward capacity estimations. You have a fill-to-spill type of system. The physics are quite simple, but the challenges will be identifying new closures in saline aquifers, as opposed to using depleted petroleum reservoirs or the structural closures that we already know quite a lot about. But there, the global capacity is relatively limited. So when it comes to structural closures, the important part here is that you rely on the seal integrity and also the well and fault integrity. In the case of Portos, here the structural closure is formed by a fault seal, and how to quantify leakage risk, especially for systems that we don't know a lot about, that haven't been used for petroleum extraction. Then understanding how to quantify the leakage risk has been very important for CCS, and that, of course, will be the case for underground hydrogen storage, that we develop workflows that allow us to assess these faults that we may not know so much about for storage of gases. So a little bit more about these possibilities for leakage. One thing we do know is that cap rocks or wells or faults are never perfectly sealing, but I think that CO2 has showed us, experience with CO2 storage has showed us that in the absence of direct proof, we do have, for example, there having been already an oil and gas accumulation, we do have quite good ways of assessing the risk of leakage along well bores, the risk of leakage through the cap rock, or the risk of leakage along faults and fracture networks. So I think this really bodes well for underground hydrogen storage, that it's been quite a lot of work gone into, especially with well integrity assessment and fault risk assessment for reservoirs where we don't already know that those faults are sealing because of the hydrocarbons that were there before we put something else there. So we've come quite a long way. There's always room for improvement, and the proof will be in the pudding, so to speak, once we actually try to inject CO2 into a faulted reservoir. But I would say that there's been a lot of work done on risk assessment for these types of systems. Of course, the big differences for underground hydrogen storage is that the storage, as opposed to CO2, which of course should be as long as possible, is much shorter. The timescales are shorter, seasonal, annual. The flow is cycling. This will have different implications on the risk assessment workflows that have been worked on and improved for CO2 storage. Hydrogen is more diffusive, it's more buoyant, it's less dense, and of course it is a commodity. Other aspects about reactivity are still unknown. Microbial consumption will be more or less important for hydrogen storage and its interaction. So these aspects, of course, need to be worked on, but having a good knowledge base from the field data and experiments and modeling for CO2 gives us a bit of a head start. And finally, I'd like to say a little bit about conversion and immobilization. I mentioned it a second ago that microbial activity is going to be important for hydrogen and getting a handle on that. For CO2, we had a similar analogous experience that understanding the reactivity of CO2, it dissolves extremely efficiently and it's quite reactive with a wide variety of minerals and materials. And this was a new flavor, so to speak, that was not a theme with petroleum. So we didn't have a lot of knowledge inherited from oil and gas and had to implement quite a large effort across research and industry to build the necessary knowledge to understand how that reactivity would affect the reliability and confidence we have in CO2 storage. So there were experiments and modeling and pilots implemented that over the years have now, I would say, successfully characterized the relevant fine-scale processes. And then the next step was then taking that fine-scale understanding and adding it to the large-scale ability to see how a CO2 plume evolves over hundreds to thousands of years and how it will eventually become trapped and secure in the pore space. And so transfer of knowledge from fine to large scale has been something that's been a theme in CO2, and I would say that approach could be mobilized in the context of hydrogen storage, especially with respect to its own reactivity and other new aspects around microbial effects and the coupled processes that are happening at the fine scale that can have a large impact on the large scale behavior. This is just an overview which I put up here to summarize. I won't go through, I've already talked about everything. The last two here are just to point out that there are some aspects with regards to monitoring, that for CO2 it's about the long-term risks, whereas for underground hydrogen storage it's about the operational and the risks and being able to monitor the commodity that you've injected into the subsurface. So those are differences there, but I think with social acceptance, that has been an area and a topic for CO2 storage that I think is quite pioneering of how to engage local stakeholders. And has been shown to be very necessary if you're going to deploy any type of underground injection onshore. And there's certainly a lot to learn here for underground hydrogen storage that we can take forward. So I'll just conclude by saying a couple things. First is that there's a huge urgency now for getting CO2 into the ground in many different settings and quite quickly. And this is really coming from the climate challenges that we're facing. Hydrogen, if it is to come and become a real part of the energy transition, it is a few years or decades behind in terms of this, using underground facilities to store the energy. But of course, the experience with natural gas storage and the learnings, the specific learnings we can transfer from CO2 can really give underground hydrogen storage a leg up and accelerate any type of deployment that will happen. The focus on resource assessment in saline aquifers, of course, is a big advantage that we can take from CO2 storage, and the developments and improvements in risk assessment of leakage, all of this can be used to help underground hydrogen storage manage its subsurface risks. And the last thing here is really about being practical and learning by doing. That's something from CO2 I think that we're learning, is that we shouldn't let perfect be the enemy of the good. We have to really test, and we have to be able to inject the fluids underground. And then, of course, always look for continual improvements and way to optimize that. So I would just like to thank everybody for their attention, and I would like to acknowledge our partners in the Center for Sustainable Subsurface Resources that helped support this lecture. Thank you very much.